Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. We're talking about gender and sexuality, and at this point, we're going to talk a little bit about weddings and kind of what weddings have had an impact on as far as our lives in general. So, our industry around the creation of weddings um, really has kind of influenced again the idea of heterosexuality, that binary ideology between men and women. And in fact, it wasn't until just a few years ago that we started seeing the legalization of marriage between two men or two women or queer or trans or whatever. That is a new reality, right? Prior to that, the idea of marriage and family making has been very much centralized upon both that puritanical legacy and the newer sort of understanding of heterosexuality. Um, as an industry, marriages are huge, right? Absolutely, positively huge when it comes to the complexity of it. Um, the average American spends somewhere in the range of about $30,000 per wedding, which is that's quite the bill, right? And it's an $80 billion industry, right? Again, that's huge. But we create this ideology around families and about weddings and about adulthood and rites of passage and what it means to become a full adult in today's society. And oftentimes that is connected to this sense of getting married, right? In fact, our government is highly focused on that kind of thing because of, if we look at our laws, right? Who has the right of, um, again, making decisions for you if you get sick, if you're in the hospital? Um, who gets to make decisions about insurance or ownership of property, of child rearing, right? All of these things are usually connected to sort of this, again, historically heterosexual and puritanical ideologies. Um, and we see these things sort of reinforced throughout our livelihoods. Um, what is appropriate for any type of particular behavior. So when we think about little girls, okay, um, oftentimes little girls are encouraged to want that princess wedding, right? So they get toys, they get dolls, they get dresses, and they start preparing for that princess style wedding. Um, their media, the cartoons and storybooks, oftentimes end when Prince Charming comes along, and they are wed, and so there is this lineage of what is appropriate for a girl to do to grow up as, right? And the same thing can be said for young boys about what is the ideal, right? And there is this sort of double standard that happens, right? Um, Especially when it comes to the idea of um, uh, concepts like virginity, right? Purity, even to the dress that is appropriate to wear, right? If you're a virgin getting married, then having that pure white dress is sort of this expression of virginity. If you're not, then you're not supposed to wear that white dress, right? You're supposed to wear, a different, slightly off-colored white, to show that you're not as pure as you should be. Um, Guys, on the other hand, are oftentimes, encouraged to sow their oats while they're young, and then get married and find that perfect girl to get married to. But they're usually not expected to be a virgin, right? and is encouraged to go out there and do that. Um, so we start creating sort of these different ideologies around this, even to the point of like um, the wedding dresses and uh, right, the fact that a wedding dress usually can cost thousands of dollars, where men will go out and just rent a suit for the day. Um, and these different practices are meant to encourage certain types of behavior, right? So a lot of times we're seeing different levels of inequity that go into this, like talking about wedding dresses, talking about uh, venues. If we go back in time, and even practices today, like giving away the bride, right? Father walks down the aisle with the bride and gives the bride to another man. And this has um, some real cultural implications, considering how women have oftentimes been treated in the past as property. Right? This is a possession. This is being owned by someone and is going to be um, given away to someone else. Right? So giving away the father, or giving away the bride by the father, um, and then we have things like dowries or bridal price, right? Where you have um, either family might have to contribute to the other family, right? If I'm going to pay a bridal price, what is a good price for a bride? Well, depending on what country you live in, it might look like, well, this bride who is a economic resource to her family, when she is missed, their resources are going to be depleted. So she might be worth, say like 3 cattle, 2 pigs, and a couple of chickens, right? Resources, resource exchange. Now, you might be surprised that that happens today in American society, that we have a bridal price. Um, and that is the ring, right? The ring right here. I don't have one. I'm not married. But that ring right there, how much does that ring cost? Right? How much should that ring cost? And usually when we think about that, the common thing is to say that a guy should go out and spend 2 months worth of their salary to buy that ring. And that ring, say when that woman passes away, that ring has value and gets passed on to her side of the family, right? So it might be her own daughter that gets it, or it might go back to her family, so her nieces or sisters or something along that line, but the women on that side of the family. So there is this price that is oftentimes used to create, right, that connection, that material price. And then the same way when it comes to the wedding itself, right? You have that bridal price, but now, whose responsibility is it for the family to put on the wedding? And that usually falls onto the side of the bride's family, right? They're the ones that foot the bill for uh, giving away their daughter, right? So they might have to pay for the food, or they might have to contribute more, and that's sort of that equalization um, of resources, right? And that's in itself is sort of creating that alliance between the families. I'm spending a lot of money on that ring. You're going to spend a lot of money on the food and cake and the venue, and then we're sort of equal, right? Each family has contributed, and so now there can be that social alliance between the families. But there is still um, generally it's on the women's side that's a little bit less equal, and that usually has to do with the possession of goods, right? A lot of times, even up until just a few decades ago, women in the United States, their possessions came with them to the new home with their partner, then they didn't have equal ownership of all the stuff. They might have had their stuff, but he also had their stuff. But she did not have his stuff, right? Or even opening up a bank account, right? There are many accounts, including from my own mother who lived in that time, where she could not open a bank account without having a male cosigner, right? Either a husband or her father, right? She could not have her own bank account without a male cosigner. And that wasn't that long ago, right? So, that was still practiced back in the 70s and early 80s. That was still happening. Anyway, so again, the capability of having resources, right? And understanding how that property is organized and recognized. Now, if you're living in a matriarchal society, the opposite is usually true. It's the woman side of the family that owns the possessions. They own the home. They own the resources, and the male in that relationship is usually becomes laborer and doesn't have as much control over those resources. Um, but that's the difference between a matriarchy and a patriarchy. Okay, so we have Alfred Kinsey, and Alfred Kinsey um, created this study of sexology, right? And is kind of referred to as one of the founders of the American sexual revolution. And it's important to know who this guy is because a lot of our ideas about modern sex and that sexual experience and gender ideology, all of that comes from a lot of his research. And this was done back in the 1940s and 1950s. Um, and he was expressively looking for sort of the practices and understanding of sexual behavior, um, both expressed in a private and in a public setting, right? In 1948, Kinsey published The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And then in 1953, he published The Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. These became known as the Kinsey Reports and had a massive influence uh, on the eventual change of American culture. So these released in the late 40s and 50s. And as people started reading these books and understanding that the traditional concepts of sexual ideology and behavior was not necessarily the same as what people were actually practicing in their own homes, right? There's that ideological truth and then the ground truth related to sex and the public and the private. Um, all of a sudden we started seeing huge cultural changes. So this is when we start seeing the big shift in the 1960s about that sexual revolution. It wasn't until people started reading these books that they got a whole new understanding about sexual behavior and were able to um, conceptualize and engage in discussion and create space for um, for different ideas relating to sex. And so we see like in the 60s and the 70s. I think I just said the 60s, the 60s. Okay. The 60s and 70s where we started seeing this sort of big evolution in um, cultural behavior around sex. Uh, that wouldn't have happened without Kinsey, right? He is a massive influence in how we have developed as a culture because it would allowed people to put names and titles and concepts to things that they had been experiencing but didn't have the capability or the language to identify, right? And that becomes really important. Is, you know, again, thinking about language, right? Language is all about being able to identify what is happening around us in any given circumstance, how we describe our universe, right? He helped create language that people can then use and understand to broaden their concept of their universe, of their sexual identity. They could go in and say, oh, so other people feel this too. I'm not alone in this, right? And then there are communities that are, being created, and then all of a sudden you start seeing big cultural change. And it takes time for that sort of cultural change to take place, right? Kinsey was talking about in the 1940s and 50s. We don't start seeing huge change, concerning sexual identity and sexual practices until the 60s and 70s. Then we start seeing, again, even more changes and challenges by the next generation, especially concerning like the LGBTQ community, into the 80s and 90s. And then that even progresses more into where we are today, where we have a much greater understanding, and the capability of even naming those things, of naming those concepts, of naming that behavior, right? That didn't just come out of the ether. It had to be developed over time. But 20, 30 years ago, the concepts that they had about sexuality and gender don't come close to our concepts that we know today, right? And that's why language is so important to um, be able to identify these different concepts and then be able to name those concepts and be able to discuss those concepts and develop those concepts even further. Okay, we're going to pause there and we'll come back in a few minutes.